Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. If you're a long-time listener to the show, you know one of my favorite things is setting out to do some historical research, only to end up in a very different place from where I first began. And that is the case with the tale I will be sharing with you today. I was digging through some archives, looking for some old ghost stories related to the American West, something involving cowboys. Well, I found the story, but from there, it morphed into more of a true crime exploration, and finally, I found myself in the middle of a Bones or CSI episode. So sit back and relax as I take you to Montana, the Big Sky country, to learn all about Rattlesnake Jake. But before we get to that, on our next Haunted Talks podcast episode, we will be revealing our findings from our 2 nights of paranormal investigations at the CN Tower in Toronto. And I think the results are going to take a lot of you by surprise. The tower is not known to be a haunted site, but it is surrounded by many locations that harbor Toronto's best ghost stories. On top of that, it is a giant antenna, and the question we pondered is if the tower can send and receive earthly signals, is it possible it may aid us in receiving signals from the other side? You're not going to want to miss that episode, so be sure to follow the show wherever you listen. Our ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto continue through the month of November, including our Alone in the Dark experience at Black Creek Pioneer Village in Toronto. To keep up to date on the latest Haunted Walk news, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, all at Haunted Walk. And please consider leaving a 5-star review wherever you listen, as it's a great way to help introduce the show to new followers. On July 3rd, 1938, the Lewistown, Montana Daily News published the following story, with the headline, "Stranger Reports Weird Experience. Sees Ghost Riding Desperados Haunting Scene of Early Day Crime." Some folks believe in ghosts. That is, they believe that the spirits of the departed, especially such have passed away in tragic or violent death, manifest themselves on certain occasions to any beholder who has an eye to perceive the supernatural. To me, that had always been pure stuff, and absolutely incredible. In view of several experiences that have happened to me very recently, however, I am free to say that there may be more in these ghostly appearances than most people will admit. The first experience I mention occurred several nights ago. As I am somewhat of a stranger in this section of Montana, and particularly in Lewistown, I'm accustomed to take solitary strolls over quiet portions of this little city, just now so intensely interested in a tragic event which happened here in the very early days of its history. On the occasion to which I refer, I was walking in the neighborhood of the beautiful hospital on the hill in the northeast part of the city. It will be remembered that there are several small coulees in that locality. Dusk had fallen, and the first dullness of night enveloped the surroundings. I looked at my watch, and it was just 9:30. As I looked vacantly toward the base of the hill facing Main Street, I perceived a shadowy form, vague of outline, but tall and sinewy, stealing out of the depression and coming toward me. As I watched the stealthy movements of this weird figure, a sort of chill crept over me, a feeling that I was seeing something not of mere flesh and blood. The shadowy figure moved absolutely noiselessly, and the remarkable thing about this ghostly appearance was that apparently I could see right through it, and I realized that I was perceiving the movements of a disembodied spirit. I could feel the goose flesh thicken along my spine, but somehow I was so fascinated by the uncanny thing I was watching that I only stood stiff in my tracks and waited the issue almost without breathing. I had frequently heard of the story of one Rattlesnake Jake, who had come to an untimely death while acting the part of a desperado on the 4th of July in Lewistown in very early days of its history, and suddenly it flashed upon my bewildered brain that I was observing an appearance of the spirit of the notorious Rattlesnake Jake. Then, while I watched with bated breath, another shadowy form came out of the dimness, leading 2 horses. The funny thing about it was that the animals were as shadowy and ghostly as the human actors in the scene before me. Gracious, I was scared stiff. However, the ghostly figures paid no attention to me. With noiseless movements and phantom-like actions, the 2 figures stole out into the open and made their way towards the outskirts of town, presently becoming smothered in the dullness of the night. Of course, I wasn't foolish enough to tell anyone of my experience, especially as a stranger in the community. I went to my hotel and sat long thinking over the strange occurrence of the early evening. The event had taken away all idea of sleep from my mind. I sat pondering until after midnight, when I decided to go out and take a walk along Main Street to cool off my excited imagination. Main Street was seemingly deserted, and there was a fog or mist filling the air, so that objects were not clearly discernible, even at close range. I walked slowly down Main Street as far as the Milwaukee Depot. Using the south side of the thoroughfare going down, I crossed to the north side of the street and continued my stroll up Main Street. When I was about halfway along the block between 3rd and 4th Avenues, I halted casually, though I sensed that there was a ghostly feeling in the air. In the dim mistiness across the street from me, standing at the curb in front of the building known as the Crowley Block, I could make out the forms of 2 horses. Yet, they were not solid flesh and blood, for I could see right through them, and not the designs of the building, even to the decorated windows. And then 2 shadowy forms seemed to emerge from the building, as if they had come through the solid walls of brick and concrete. I was frightened, not from fear of personal danger, but the thought I was witnessing again to the actions of ghostly beings long since returned to the dust. I recognized the 2 figures as those I had seen earlier in the evening, and I stood tense and waiting for further movements of the shadowy beings who had been disturbed from their slumber in the unmarked graves. I right there began to believe that there must be some foundation, in fact, for the stories about ghostly apparitions. If not, I was certainly seeing things. Right here, I may say that I'm a strictly temperate man, and generally have pretty fair control of my nerves. Suddenly, the taller of the two forms began gesticulating, as if referring to people on the street, and the two waved long, skeleton-like arms over the scene around them. Then, in a twinkling, the shadowy forms mounted the horses with movements as soundless as the grave. They scurried up Main Street, riding wildly and recklessly, though with no sound of hurrying hoofs. As I stood as one entranced by the uncanny and weird performance of the supernatural horsemen, the ghostly riders vanished into the gloom on Upper Main Street, leaving me obsessed with a chilling creepiness. That was the last I saw of the apparitions. I give this story for what it's worth. No doubt, many will scoff at the idea that I really saw the ghosts of Rattlesnake Jake and his pal, but to me the appearances were as real as if I had met these characters face to face. I'm sure it was not a case of overwrought imagination, for I believe the spirits of Charles Fallon and Charlie Owens were revisiting the scenes of their deadly orgies on that fateful 4th of July, 1884. There were a few things that immediately struck me about this article. The first was just how well it was written, and what a great story it was, with desperados from an earlier time returning to the scene of their crime and ultimately their deaths. Rattlesnake Jake is a great name, and it did ring a bell for me, but I couldn't remember why. It turns out Rattlesnake Jake was a character in the animated film Rango, which came out in 2011 and was voiced by Bill Nye. While the article gave some of the historical details about Rattlesnake Jake, I was eager to learn more about this story and what happened on that fateful 4th. And what a story it is. Like many great legends over time, there are several different versions or accounts of what happened on that day and a few days leading up to it. So I'll do my best to share a general overview of what happened from the most reliable sources. Rattlesnake Jake, whose real name was Charles Owen, and his partner, Charles Fallon, also known as Buckskin Owen, were horse thieves, cattle rustlers, the classic bad guys from Western movies. The Fergus County Argus on June 29, 1904, referred to them as two of the worst characters that ever stole a horse or committed a murder. With them, thievery was a regular calling, and murder and arson were the merriest of incidents. Large rewards were offered for them, dead or alive, and the desperate manner in which they sold their worthless lives tells more vividly than any words the sort of men that they were. The two men arrived just outside Lewistown in June of 1884. And despite doing their best not to be seen by the locals, eventually word got out that these two men, with the substantial rewards for their capture or death, got around to the locals. And a plan was hatched to bring these two men to justice. Under the guise of horse trading, Buckskin Owen and Rattlesnake Jake were invited a short ways from the village. The article goes on to say that Rattlesnake Jake was the more conspicuous of the two. His long, dark hair and keen and piercing eyes gave way to a nervous watchfulness, which distinguished him even in those days when little attention was paid to unusual characteristics. His companion, Buckskin Owen, was also constantly on the lookout, and upon the slightest suggestion of a suspicious movement on the part of anyone standing near him, his hand was always ready to go to his gun. Both men were heavily armed at all times, each carrying a brace of big revolvers, a Winchester, and large hunting knives. Despite the plan of the locals, they didn't find an opportunity to capture the two men. The day of intense drama on July 4th really starts taking shape the day before, on July 3rd, when Rattlesnake and Buckskin attended a horse race not far from Lewistown. They'd placed their money on a horse and had lost. They were quite upset, but learned that the horse was going to be running in another race in Lewistown the next day. They decided they would bet again to try to win their losses back. It must have really boosted their confidence when they learned that the horse that they like would be racing against a one-eyed gray mare. Nevertheless, that one-eyed gray mare won by several lengths. This double loss really put Rattlesnake Jake and Buckskin Owens in a sour mood, and they began to harass one of the locals at the races, who was also dressed as Uncle Sam at the time. Some words were exchanged, and Rattlesnake Jake ended up striking this fellow over the head with the butt of his revolver, knocking him to the ground. He then placed his cocked revolver into the man's mouth. Another local then stepped up, begging Rattlesnake Jake not to shoot the man while he was down, which caused Jake to turn on the crowd in a threatening manner, as he said to Buckskin, "Well, I guess we'll just have to clean out this town." They jumped on their horses, rode into town, and took up station at Crowley's Saloon, where they began to enjoy several drinks. While the outlaws were busy, the locals had arrived from the horse race, and realizing there was going to be trouble, went into their homes and the local store and began arming themselves with Winchesters and revolvers. After having 3 drinks, Buckskin and Rattlesnake headed out the door of the saloon. Rattlesnake spied the man who had broken up the earlier confrontation just across the street, and was quoted as saying he wanted to kill that son of a bitch. The shooting erupted immediately from Rattlesnake. The local fired back with a borrowed .32 caliber pistol, hitting Rattlesnake in the left forefinger. This caused him to switch hands with his revolver and fire back at the local, who ducked safely out of sight. At this point, all hell broke loose. The scene was one of total chaos. Many bystanders who were in town for the celebration ran and hid. Buckskin was riding his horse and discharging his Winchester .30 rifle at anyone he could see, when he took a bullet to the abdomen. He headed his horse out of town toward Big Spring Creek, but only got part way when he realized that Rattlesnake was pinned down at the photographer's tent. And returning to the article again, it's described as, though he was a knave of the deepest dye, he also possessed some heroic qualities. Looking back, he saw that his pal Rattlesnake was wounded and unable to get away. Without a second hesitation, he turned his horse and went back to his friend, making himself an easy target all along the way for a shower of bullets. He might have ridden out into the hills and ultimately made his escape, as there were dozens of places in the basin where people of his ilk would be given food and nursing until recovering from his wounds. But he truly turned his back on probable safety and went to assure and quick death at the side of his comrade. The two outlaws made their last stand near the photographer's tent. They were subjected to merciless fire from Power's store, Crowley and Kemp's saloon, Simon's saloon, and Crowley's ice home. But they returned lead for lead, desperately and coolly reloading their guns several times. Buckskin took 5 shots before he fell, and he continued shooting until he had not enough strength to support himself. And after lying down, he kept shooting as long as there was life in him. Rattlesnake Jake, with his right arm broken, kept shooting with his other hand. Another ball broke his right leg, and supporting himself by the other, he kept shooting. Another ball struck his chin, carrying away half his jaw. When he fell on the ground, he raised himself up on his side and kept shooting. From weakness, he could not support himself any longer and fired his last shots lying flat on the ground. There were 9 balls in him before he gave up. Just before he drew his last breath, he made an effort to draw his pistol again, but had not the strength, and it fell by his side. The next afternoon, the bodies of the 2 men were photographed by Ed Clark, which were eventually sold as postcards. The bodies were then buried in a nearby field, but the owner of that field so strongly objected to having these bad men buried nearby that the bodies were dug up and, with ropes placed around their necks or feet, were dragged across the plain into a coulee where they were covered with a small amount of dirt and left to the elements. An eyewitness who was there, tagging along on his horse behind the gruesome burial, saw bits of hair and skin from the decomposing bodies being snagged as it was dragged through the brush. Quite the story. Even at the time, there was a lot of debate about the motives of these 2 men and why they engaged in such an unwinnable battle. Some suggested that they had planned to hold up the entire village, as one of the stores was known to have a large amount of cash at the time, and that they had grossly underestimated the locals and thought with a couple of big guns they could walk into town and just take whatever they wanted. There is another possible explanation, though. Around this time in 1884, cattle rustling and horse thieves were very prevalent, and the owners of the stockyards were fed up with losing so many animals to these thieves. So, a group of men, which we can simply call vigilantes, were sent out by these business owners to round up troublemakers like Buckskin and Rattlesnake. So is it possible that the wild gambling the 2 days before and the ultimate shootout that took their lives was partly inspired because they knew their end was coming? It was only a matter of time before they were caught, or worse, and were making one last desperate attempt to accrue significant money to make an escape somewhere far from Montana. As you might imagine, this story really became a point of local pride, as the locals banded together and stood up against these gun-toting miscreants. In fact, for decades, the town would hold reenactments about their victory over the outlaws. And I must now confess, there is something a little bit odd about that ghost story I shared with you to start the episode. In small print, there is an editor's note, which reads, "The following weird story was submitted by a stranger who had been visiting in the city several days from a distance and who apparently has been deeply impressed with the oft-told tale of the shooting of Rattlesnake Jake and his pal, which occurred here on July 4th, 1884, and will be reenacted Sunday and Monday as a feature of the 1938 Lewistown Stampede. That's right. The ghost story I read you was a clever advertisement for the reenactment that took place in 1938. But the story doesn't end there. Many years later, sometime in the 1920s or 30s, two skulls were found in the area where the men were supposedly buried and were placed on display at the Fergus County Courthouse. In the 1960s, one of the skulls went home with a courthouse secretary as, I believe, a retirement gift, and the other went to the Central Montana Historical Museum, where it was on public display for decades, claiming to be the skull of Rattlesnake Jake. In 2005, a forensic anthropology student, Susan Craun, wanted to try to determine if the skull was actually rattlesnakes, and set out an intense investigative process to see which conclusions could be made. I tracked down Susan and asked her to join us to share her part of this incredible story. Susan Craun, thank you so much for joining us on Haunted Talks.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm very eager to chat with you because, as listeners of the show know, I love a historical mystery, and you found yourself working quite closely on one to do with the potential skull of Rattlesnake Jake, who we've been talking a little bit about in this episode. So maybe could you fill us in on the backstory, how you came to work on this project, what was going on in your life that this is kind of where your interests took you?
Well, I decided to go back to school. I'd had my business degree from the 1980s, and business is a lot different now. And I knew that was not a field I was interested in. So I went back actually to work on a bachelor's/master's in history and ended up in the anthropology department, and ended up in, actually more specifically, in the Forensic Anthropology department at the University of Montana. And in taking some of those courses, one of the classes we had, one of the best instructors I ever had is Gary Kerr, instructor at the university. And he did the human identifications class. One of the things we practiced on was, in human identification, was doing a skull. And so Gary was talking about one of his favorite stories that he had heard was about this outlaw named Rattlesnake Jake. And he would regale us with the story in class, going through Gary and going to the museum in Lewistown. They had the skull on display. And I was kind of like, I don't know how accurate that would be. Because the story, was that it was buried, dug up, reburied, put on display at the courthouse, given as a trophy or a reward, a retirement award. And I'm like, okay, somebody's got to prove this. And so going through Gary, that really piqued my interest. And it's Montana. And I'm all for things Montana history. Absolutely love my state, and I love the mystery.
So the Central Montana Historical Museum in Lewiston must have had the display, because your paper published in 2005, and I believe you note that it was first put on display in the museum in the late 60s, early 70s. For 30 years or so, it was in the museum and identified as, this is the skull of Rattlesnake Jake.
Right. It actually started on display prior to that at the courthouse, and then from the courthouse to the museum. One of the skulls, there were two skulls that they believed were Rattlesnake Jake and Buckskin Owens, and one was given as a retirement gift, supposedly, and the other one went to the museum because they didn't want it in the courthouse anymore. And so, yeah, so it's to me that's just fascinating. How can try not to judge, I guess, using today's standards, how we judge human remains and how we take care of them compared to even just 50, 100 years ago, how human remains were treated. So yeah, it was on display.
Now, you mentioned the term forensic anthropology. Could you unpack that a little more for us? What does it
Right.
mean, the term itself?
A lot of people, when they think anthropology, is primates. That's usually the first thing when the study of apes, which is definitely one area. It's a huge field. Forensic anthropology has turned to the Temperate Brennan books, the TV show Bones, and that's more of what forensic anthropology does. Of course, we don't get the good-looking FBI agents or the unlimited budget, but what story do these bones tell? What can we tell from this person?
Your hypothesis was obviously, the museum is claiming that this is Rattlesnake
Right.
Jake's skull. What information did you have, or what information were you able to gather about Rattlesnake Jake that you were then able to use as you examined the skull itself? What markers or identifying factors were you looking for through that process?
But being that I only had the skull, there was no mandible, so there's no lower jaw. So we found one that sort of fit, that we could come up with a face. And then I dove into the history books, talked to people I could talk to. Wow, where'd you get this story? Where'd you get that story? So it went after a lot of hearsay information, which, of course, in the late 1800s was all hyped to sell the paper. The only piece de resistance that I never got that I wanted is there was supposedly postcards made. So, in other words, the photographer comes around, you're laid up in your coffin, and then they actually put it out as a postcard, like a trading card for people to have. And have not come across one. I'm sure that somebody's got one in a box in an attic or a basement. And it would be really interesting then to be able to take a picture and put up against the information that we have, the knowledge we've gained, and see if we were even close.
Well, that was one of the questions I was eager to ask you, hoping that maybe it had been discovered since you've written the paper, but it's
No.
still out in the ether. Certainly, if anyone listening believes they have a copy of that photo, I think Susan and I would both
Oh,
be very interested
yes,
in
absolutely.
seeing a copy of that. Now, before I ask you about your analysis itself and what it revealed and kind of the conclusions or inferences you think you were able to make, I'm just curious about kind of a personal question, I guess, is you were working very closely with this skull. I was wondering how that felt. Did you feel kind of a bit of a weight of history, or in your class, was it common to be working with remains where it didn't really affect you? Or what was it like personally, like dealing with an inanimate object, though, that was very much a person at one time?
It's for me, it's very personal. I've worked on human remains from, hunters find them when they're out trekking across the prairie that we find could possibly be Native Americans, all the way to your local cemetery. Didn't know somebody was buried there, and so to me, it's always a weight of responsibility because this was a person that we knew. This is somebody's human remains. This is what we have left. So there's, oh yeah, it was. I felt like I was walking around with fine china the whole time, because the last thing I wanted to do was to have something happen that it could possibly break. I brought it over from the museum. We cast it along with Gary's help. We made several molds of it so we could cast it in the future and use the cast. And then about 3 weeks later, I took it back. I just didn't want it sitting around. I didn't want it locked in a cabinet. It was not mine to begin with, one. And two, I needed something I could work with. And three, it was somebody. It's when you have it, it's somebody. They can't talk. They can't tell you their story. So I look at it as my job to try to tell the story the best I can.
And I think that leads into kind of the key question. What story did this skull tell you after you did this historical research? I assume you had certain physical features or attributes you were expecting to find if it was Rattlesnake Jake. How did what you were expecting line up with the actual physical properties of the skull itself?
Marks wise, if I was to read the articles, I should have had bullet wounds everywhere. There would have been no way it would have stuck together if it had, that many bullet wounds to it. I expected a big hole up front in the forehead and an exit wound in the back. And there were no exit wounds at all. No entrance wounds for that matter. There were some deformities in the bone, which could have looked like it had happened during the lifetime of the individual based on the amount of healing taking place on the bone at that location. Was not expecting to find teeth per se, because one of the descriptions, as they moved the remains across the prairie, of course, parts and pieces were left behind.
So it kind of sounds like in all these measurements you're looking at, comparing against the other scientific research, it really sounds like a case of probability. This individual
Yes.
is most likely X, 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 and Y. With this particular skull, what was your finding as far as those key characteristics? Did it seem to be a male of the right age? You mentioned missing some of the injuries we might suspect. What were your
Right.
conclusions?
Well, the conclusion definitely came into being a male in mid to late 20s, early 30s. Again, this is kind of like that. You're putting a puzzle back together, and depending on how many pieces you have. And in this case, we didn't have the mandible, which, if you think about the lower jaw, very much shapes the face that we interact with. And not having one and trying to find one that possibly could have worked. This possibly could have been him. So that lowers this is 100% down to at least 80%. The wounds that were described, they weren't there. Like I said earlier, or mentioned earlier, that I wanted to see, there should have been entrance and exit wounds. They should have been riddled. There should have anywhere upwards of 25 or more should have happened on the skull if you take all the stories and put all the bullet wounds together. And that just wasn't there. There were no entrance or exit wounds. There was a what looked like could have been a groove down a cheek, but then you look at it again and go, okay, but they were also moved. So you have to then, was anything damaged in that move as well? So the likelihood that this was male was pretty good. Based on how the sutures did, it was male, 20s to 30s, mid to late 20s ish to 30s.
And how old was Rattlesnake Jake at the time of his death?
We believe he was in his late 20s.
You end the paper while acknowledging the limitations of the material you had to work
Right.
with. And you say that you believe to maybe an 80% certainty that this was not the skull of Rattlesnake Jake, primarily because of you didn't see the injuries from the gunfight itself,
Right.
or the damage to the skull as the corpses were dragged across to their second
Right.
burial plot. I'm wondering, 20 years later, does that number still feel about right to you, or having been thinking about it over time, do you still think your 80% that this was not Rattlesnake Jake is still in the right ballpark?
I think so. Nowadays, with the modern, how much forensics has changed, and the ability to measure and compare things just in the last 20 years is outstanding. It's amazing that if you can do more in-depth study, you can take more accurate measurements. I still would say no, simply because there is no paper trail. The skulls have been used on display at the courthouse. They were given as a retirement gift to one person and the other one put on display. There's no paper trail. it's hearsay. And that leaves me the 80% simply based on what I had. And yeah, I stick by that. I'm still solid that there's no way. There's just, there's no wounds. I want wounds. Now, will my opinion change if I ever see the postcard? That very well might. But yeah, no, my 80% is still, I think, dead on in a fair representation.
If we permit ourselves the space to say, well, this may or may not be the skull of Rattlesnake Jake. And from what I understand, this is a fairly formative part of the legend of the town, and something where reenactments were held for decades kind of after it. I wonder what your feelings are if you think an artifact like that should be displayed at a museum. Well, we're not sure of the pedigree of the item, right, but also regardless of the terrible actions of the person. And I don't think there's no debate as far as I understand that, these were very rough, murderous kind of characters. Is this something we should be looking at in that context? Or what do you think the museum should do with the skull at this point?
I would like to see them ask for a cast or to have it 3D scanned and then turn it over to the state and have it buried, or find a place in Lewistown that it can be buried. That's my personal opinion. I don't think human remains need to be on display. It's not a necessity in this lifetime. I think that with modern technology out there, you can gain reproductions that can sit in that place. And I don't think that you need to have the skull available anymore. I think that the actual skull needs to be repatriated back to whence it came.
If you would like to read Susan's paper for yourself, there is a link in the show notes. I did reach out to the Central Montana Museum to confirm that the skull was still on public display, and it turns out it very much is. The museum closes after Labor Day, but will be reopening next May. So if you find yourself in and around that neck of the woods, I would love to see some photos of how they have it set up. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. And a very special thanks to Susan Craun for joining us to talk about her paper. If you would like to see some of the photos she included in her master's thesis, including some of the facial reconstructions that her and her fellow classmates did, you can find those in the show notes and on our episode page at hauntedwalk.com. On our website, you can also find information about all of our ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto. And don't forget, as a Haunted Talks listener, you can use the promo code HauntedTalks at checkout to get 15% off your ghost tour tickets. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.